First, thank you for letting me share my time with you as we try and navigate this new abnormal world that we're living in. So I'm going to do my new hello, which I've been doing for a while, but now seems to be a little bit more socially acceptable than shaking hands. So I'm going to say hello to you in that way. And I will. I had started by with this puzzle. I usually like to start off with just to get the juices flowing. And some of you actually might have seen this puzzle before. If you haven't, so some of you have seen it before. And in case you haven't seen it before, the letter that you would have needed to use for this is the letter F, because if you take the letter F and put it right there, then using the line on the bottom, that would it would turn it into an E, and then you would get the creative. Because creativity is about being able to do two things. One is to be able to come up with new and novel ideas, and then to be able to use them in effective ways. Because it's not just coming up with ideas, but we need to be able to do something with them. So thank you. And why didn't that work? Okay, so there we go. I'm going to start off with a quote, which is from Kierkegaard. People demand freedom of speech as a compensation for the freedom of thought, which they seldom use. I liked this quote, but it turned out that when I fact-checked it, it's not accurate. And so it turns out in Kierkegaard, the quote is, "How absurd men are. They never use the liberties they have. They demand those that they do not have. They have freedom of thought. They demand freedom of speech." Okay? But I thought that this sort of take on that quote, I sort of enjoyed. And then I came up. Why isn't it working? Then I came up with a quote on my own, thanks to Kant and Albert Einstein. Freedom of thought without freedom of speech is empty, but freedom of speech without freedom of thought is blind. And if you've been following the news, even just recently, it's a very timely discussion. So I intend this talk to be about the freedom of thought and what it would mean to actually have freedom of thought. Oops, actually, I don't want to do that yet. How do I go backwards? Yeah. In the university, we have the tenure system in academia in order to protect the academic freedom of professors. But what we don't have, or what we still need to worry about, is how do we protect the academic freedom of our students? And I am still not working here. Here, give me 1 second, because my technology is still not working, and maybe it's working now a little bit more. Okay. No, still not working. Okay. So how do we protect the academic freedom of students so that we're able to help them, have freedom of thought and have freedom of expression? When we get to the meat of the talk, I want to talk about, and I hope you can give me some examples or counter-examples of times when students maybe should not be allowed to be able to freely express themselves. In On Liberty, Mill, which is the classic formulation of like the liberal position, he said that informal mechanisms of social pressure and expectation in mass democratic societies would be all controlling. And he worried that the exercise of those powers would lead to stifling confirmation in thought, character, and action. And so one of the things that actually spurred this talk for me was actually from a presentation in the last year's meeting of the International Society of Political Psychologists. And at that meeting, Sean Rosenberg actually argued that the democracy as a political institution around the world is dying. And statistically, you can see 50 years ago, the number of democracies was rising, and now they're on the decline, and authoritarian governments seem to be on the rise. His diagnosis was that people just don't have the intellectual patience for it. If you're going to be part of a democracy, it requires work. You need to be able to appreciate multiple perspectives, and you need to be able to find compromise with those perspectives, which involves respecting differing positions. We live here in a representative democracy, a republic, but when it was formed, the Constitution, one of the things that it was intended to do was to avoid tyranny, right? Where the King George was making the rules and there wasn't equal voices for people. And I suggest that the classroom is analogous to a public forum, that we can use the tools in the classroom to actually help students become responsible citizens. So my answer to Sean Rosenberg, if democracy is dying, then what we need to do is we need to help students think for themselves and help students to become functioning members of a democracy. And I believe that we can use the classroom as a crucible to be able to do that. So that's what I want to do today, is show how the public forum in the classroom shows how freedom of thought is needed to make students think for themselves. And actually, when I was writing this, I actually had the word force here. Whoops, I had to force students to think for themselves. And I was reading it off to my wife, and she said, no, maybe it should just be invite. And I agree with the word invite on one level, but I'm actually concerned that it wouldn't actually have the same. What happens if someone doesn't accept the invitation? What do you do then? And I actually think that we have more of a moral responsibility in the classroom and in terms of making sure that students have freedom of thought. Because I'm not sure how much practice they have in it, especially as I read the news and find out the other examples of the leaders that we find today. And so in that regard, just a little bit of background. The Greek word truth is aletheia, and letheia means to be which is covered. And so aletheia is that which is uncovered, or the process of uncovering or revealing what the truth might be. And so then, if things are going to get in the way of doing that, are those things that would hide or, would conceal the truth. And I think Kennedy put it nice, not the lie, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. And you know what? I got to tell you, the discomfort of thought is discomforting. Socrates said that he was willing to die rather than living the unexamined life. And so, but it takes work to do if you're going to try and avoid. Since I'm talking today about the freedom of thought, how do we avoid the tyranny of thought in the classroom? And there are several traps that we ourselves can fall into in this regard when we're trying to do it. And so, in this regard, a little bit more background is that the skeptics, the original skeptics, 2,500 years ago, when they looked at arguments, or actually, I'm going to say 2,000 years ago, the they noticed that there were three types of people in the world, or three attitudes that you could take towards the truth. Dogmatism is the attitude that there is a truth and you know what it is. I gave a couple of examples here of dogmatists. There are many more that you could give in this regard. If you say you know that something is true and you're not willing to question it because it is a foundational truth, then you are a dogmatist. Okay? There are also relativists where you would end up saying, and I imagine that in the academic culture today, people are much more familiar with this idea of relativism, that truth does not exist, that there are no absolutes. Nietzsche is probably helpful foundation in this regard. Protagoras was probably the most famous original, sophist around Socrates' time, who argued that there is no absolute truth, that humans are the measure of all things, right? And so it was the idea of relativism. Today, you find it in postmodernism, right? The idea that a text doesn't have a meaning with a capital M, but that each person will end up making the meaning for the reading of the text, and even more importantly, that no text has a privileged meaning, or no person has a privileged meaning towards a text. And that means that essentially that there is no essential meaning, there is no true meaning, and that truth is relative. The skeptic position is actually doesn't say that there is a truth and doesn't say that there isn't one either. It's really easy when the word skeptic gets confused, I think, with denial and things like that. Skeptikos is the Greek word for inquiry, and it means to look. And if you're trying to look genuinely, then that means you don't know what the truth is. And you're willing to admit the possibility that maybe there is a truth or maybe there isn't. But you're not standing on either of the fence that there is one or that there isn't one. And I think the historical Socrates as opposed to Plato's Socrates could fall in that camp. And then I would ask you, which camp do you fall in? If you're trying to see where you fit in here. And I'm also, I suppose, open to the possibility, maybe this is a problem here. Maybe I shouldn't do this way. Hold on. I want to do this way so that I can still. No, I don't know what I did. Okay. I still shared the screen with you. You can still see this, right? I apologize if you're seeing the other things that are here too. Is my screen still being shared with you? Okay, good. I haven't been, I think I'm still no good at this text, so I haven't noticed, yeah, there is a chat box and I haven't been able to. Okay, good. Choose a screen to share. Okay. So here we are. And I would ask you where you were on this chart, where you would find yourself. The Of these three attitudes, dogmatism has been the most popular, and it's the easiest to defend, especially if you ignore any evidence that contradicts your dogmatic position or systematically attack it as fake news. In the connection between the classroom and the public forum, dogmatism is analogous to a tyrannical position. I suggest that we as professors can sometimes fall into that trap. The relativist position is the most one common in the current postmodern environment, echoed in the refrain, this makes all opinions equal. And you've probably heard your students say that everyone's entitled to their opinion, right? Consonant with the freedom of expression. But it hides a danger which can be seen today in the way that the First Amendment is being weaponized, used to promote hate speech, white supremacy, and many other fringe views. Add money to the equation, and the result is a weird perversion of Mill's tyranny of the majority, where the wealthy, with the help of Citizens United, can disproportionately influence elections, and thus laws and society as a whole. That's the relativist position. The skeptical position is the hardest one to understand. Whoops, what did I do here? The hardest to understand and the hardest to practice. But it's the most important one if you're to avoid the tyranny of dogmatism on the one hand and the epistemological vacuum of relativism on the other hand. And then if you're going to understand the skeptical position, what you need to understand is the Agrippin or the Munchausen trilemma. This is a theory in epistemology that ends up saying that all attempts to prove a claim to be actually true will fail. Now, just to be clear, this doesn't mean that everyone is false. That would be the relativist position. It doesn't mean that no claim is true. It just means that if you tried to prove that your claim was true, you would always fail. Right? And then in epistemology, what ends up happening is you would fall into one of these three traps. I'm actually going to do them in the other order than you noticed here. I'm going to offer here some examples from public discourse. And my favorite figure that exemplifies these epistemological pitfalls, DJT, the Twitter-in-chief. The best that I can glean from Trump's words, he is an expert in many fields, including medicine, military, taxes, promoting inequality, building walls. Actually, you might... Oh, why can't the... Oh, you know what? Did that video just show? It didn't show, did it? This is all this screen. Okay. I'll just. We'd be here way too long if I played all of that. But you get the idea. As a purported authority in so many fields, his claims can be trusted on their face without any need for checking. So if he says that not wearing a mask is the right thing to do for him, then everyone is correct to follow his example entirely on his dogmatic claim to be correct. Right? This is what I'm calling here an arbitrary axiomatic assumption. Right? You can be right if you just claim that you are right. But just claiming you are right is different than actually being right if you are trying to prove it. Okay? The circularity loop is easily seen in the relationship between Trump and Fox News. A recent example is hydroxychloroquine, when Tucker Carlson's guest touted a 100% success rate of a French study that was not double-blinded, and the results were selectively reported, but that didn't matter. Hours later, Trump hailed hydroxychloroquine, and then soon after, Fox News then reported that Trump hails hydroxychloroquine, and the circularity trap is complete. Because if you try and prove something with a second thing and then use the second thing to justify the first thing, then you have a nice trap there. The third trap involves making justification a never-ending and thus an unreliable process. This is what I refer to as the turtles all the way down problem, borrowing a phrase from Stephen Hawking in the first chapter of Brief History of Time. Because a little old lady was saying that the world didn't work that way at all. Stephen Hawking asks, and she says, the world's carried on the back of a very large turtle. So Hawking asks, what is the turtle? What's holding up the turtle? And the woman says, another very large turtle. And then to the question, what was holding up that turtle? The answer was, it's turtles all the way down. Right? Now that idea of that continually relying on something else for justification, justify a claim, one uses another source to provide credibility, which makes the first source correct, provided that the second one is. But what makes the second source credible? Obviously, source number 3. And then what I love about the turtles all the way down image is, don't you want to just ask all the way down to what? Right? Like it needs some sort of ground in order to make sense. The potential unreliability of sources for fact-checking is one reason why many teachers disallow students to use Wikipedia as a reference. But if Wikipedia is not reliable, then what is? Ironically, if you look... if you Google, is Wikipedia a reliable source? You will actually find a Wikipedia page claiming asking about whether Wikipedia is a reliable source or not. Turns out it says that it's not a reliable source. Okay, so it avoids the circularity trap, as it turns out. I'm suggesting in this case. Right? The trap of credibility is fraught with dangers. DJT just tweeted recently that the mail-in ballots are substantially fraudulent. Robberies and forgeries. A day later, Twitter added a link to those posts about getting facts about mail-in ballots. That link, so you can see the quote, that was a quote, and then they stuck that link into it. That link actually went to a, where did it go? No, I can't find it. It actually went to a CNN article here about the ballots and things like that, right? But here's the problem. How do we know that CNN is reliable? CNN mentions a Loyola study, but how do we know that that is reliable? There was an integrity voting commission that Trump had, but apparently it was questioned. The checking of checkers is a never-ending process with no acceptable termination point. in terms of absolute truth, which means that nothing can be proved actually true. But there's a really easy way to shortchange this process. Instead of saying that the checker needs checking, all you have to do is say that the checker is automatically wrong. Fake news. Now there's no need to do further checking of the source. This is the epistemologically Machiavellian way of subverting freedom of thought. Okay? Both dogmatism and relativism, I suggest, lead to the subversion of thought and not the freedom of thought. Instead of just tyrannically stating that something is true, systematically discredit any source that challenges the credibility of that claim, and the tyrannical circle is complete. Alternative facts has replaced both military intelligence and statistical significance as my favorite oxymorons. What does this have to do with free speech? Just yesterday, Trump said Twitter was stifling free speech by inserting a fact-checking link in his tweet. But Twitter did not delete the tweet, which would have been a clearer case of censorship. All Twitter did was to say, here's another view. So the question is, should all views be heard? Should all views be accepted? These are not identical questions, but they do not require identical answers. But here's the issue. In the classroom, is everyone entitled to their opinion? Are all opinions equal? Should every view be heard? Mark Sargent, a popular flat earther, I don't know if you're into like flat earth or not, but Mark Sargent relays a story about a science teacher that was stating that the earth spins at 1,000 miles an hour, goes around the sun, when 1/3 of the class erupted and said, no, it doesn't. The audience at the Flat Earth Conference cheered. My question is, how do you react to that story? Was it a good thing that those students spoke up? Should their voice have been respected? Or should something else have happened? I still don't know where I am here. Why and I can't... No. Where's... Oh, I know what I'm trying to do. No, I don't even know what I'm trying to do. Okay. I apologize, I'm still trying to get... Where are we? What screen? I'm sharing this screen. I don't know what the heck I'm doing anymore. Okay. What should we do in that situation? Should students be able to say that? Or some views should be censored? That's the question. My proposal is that every student should be allowed in any class to say anything that they want. That's the way to avoid the censorship. Can't even say it. Censorship trap. Okay? You want students to be able to say anything. But I suggest, first thing is that claims need to be placed in the critical context of the class. So if you have in a biology class and someone brings up a claim about the Bible, well then that's not appropriate for that class unless the point was being able to turned into a falsifiable hypothesis that could actually be addressed in the Bible class. That's why I actually have way more respect for biblical literalists who try and argue for things like flood geology and argue that the flood made the Grand Canyon and killed all the animals, as opposed to just God can do whatever God wants to do, or that dinosaurs never existed and the fossils are just tricks of the devil. Okay? So the first thing professors, we need to be able to say is, or understand the context of the class to be able to say, here's what we're talking about in this class. Okay? The second thing we need to be able to do is we need to take any claim and then assess it for biases or fallacies. If a student says that Trump is racist, well, that is an ad hominem fallacy, and that's just attacking the person and not their position. Okay? You know that there was an uptick in cases of people who had asked about drinking bleach and taking disinfectant. Well, in that case, they were falling for the false authority appeal, right? They were appealing to a false authority, using Donald Trump as an authority on medical matters, even though, apart from his uncle being an MIT professor, he doesn't have any specific medical background or medical degree. Okay? There's all different kinds of biases and fallacies that we could fall into. And try this one. After Sandy Hook, the NRA said that violent video games are responsible for mass shootings. And there's an example of the correlation cause confusion. Many people play violent video games. They don't all turn into mass shooters. Right? And so you can very easily fall into those traps. Are we able to, I suggest, let students say whatever they want to say and then be able to understand, well, is there a bias or a fallacy in what you're saying, some kind of cognitive limitation? And then after that, you would still need to then look, if you've done those things, why this is not changing, you would then need to look to see what are the presuppositions of the claims. Hitler hated Jews, right? Now it turns out that Hitler's father abused him and Hitler's grandfather was Jewish. This is in no way condemned. Remember, we were talking about like bringing presuppositions to light. And how they can happen in like unusual ways. So, for instance, if you remember a little while ago, there was a shooter in El Paso that was targeting Mexicans. The mainstream media reports it as an anti-immigration track and blames Trump for it. I was reading a Breitbart article that said that the mainstream media misses the point. So I went and I actually found the manifesto, which wasn't easy to find. And it turns out, by the way, in the manifesto, he champions universal health care. He's anti-corporation because he says that corporations are going to make more automation and meaning the loss of jobs. And big corporations destroy the environment. Those were negatives for him. And immigration is helping corporations and hurting Americans. He actually referenced this thing called the Great Replacement Hypothesis by Renaud Camus, which happening in France, and he was arguing that Muslim immigration in France was actually making white Europeans go extinct. And so he was actually making an argument for preserving the racial identity of white Europeans. Now, interestingly enough, white supremacists can latch onto this idea and then falsely, use it as a cover for xenophobia. So they were actually arguing for this great replacement hypothesis is an argument for diversity, but in isolation. So I want diversity, according to this hypothesis, but I just want it all alone. Like everyone going doing their own thing. That wouldn't really justify killing people who were coming into your land. So then the question would be, are you willing to support social programs that help displaced people have a land of their own That would be a kind of question if you were going to have the inquiry into examining these views. That's the kind of thing hopefully you could ask. And this is actually a little bit challenging for me because Denmark and Finland actually report the highest standards of living in the world. Whoops, I just did something. And they're not racially diverse. And so that's a little bit of like, so what do we want? And I'm only going to leave that as like as a question. I'm not proposing any answers here, but more what I'm talking about is that these things need to be brought to light. Inquiry needs to happen. Views don't need to be hidden. They need to be brought to light so that we can avoid the tyranny of thought. But it doesn't just mean letting every view be heard. It means letting every view be heard and let every view be subject to critical investigation, to critical inquiry. And that if we could help our students do that, that we could actually then train them to be better citizens and better thinkers. One of my models for the Socratic teaching method is Leonard Nelson. And I want to leave you with a couple of quotes from Leonard Nelson, which is, let us keep firmly in mind the one influence that must be excluded unconditionally, the influence that might emanate from the instructor's assertions. If you tell a student that they're wrong, then you are influencing them. If this influence is not eliminated, all labor is in vain. The instructor will have done everything possible to forestall the pupil's own judgment by offering him or her a ready-made judgment. And then finally, if the end of education is rational self-determination, if that's what we want, and if the condition in which the individual does not allow his behavior to be determined by outside influences, but judges and acts according to his own insight, the question arises, how can we affect a person by outside influences so that he will not permit himself to be affected by outside influences? The only thing I suggest that we can do is that we model and make sure that students have freedom of thought, which means express every view and then have every view subject to critical inquiry, because we don't know whether it's right or wrong, but we could learn from everything, and we can help students become better students, better thinkers, and better citizens. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing the screen right now. And I apologize for the technical problems. I'm very much honored for every of you that were able to wait around. I hope that I've said some controversial things at least. And so whatever time I have time, so if you found any questions or comments, while you're doing that, I'm going to take a quick look through the chats so that I can find, oh yeah, it's an engagement policy. That's good. Yeah, confusion is not a bad thing. Everyone is confused. Socrates said that he didn't know, and that's why he was asking the questions. I think it's really hard as professors because we're experts in our field, and that we know our field better than our students do because we've studied it more. But I suggest that that difference is on a sliding scale. We're not categorically different than our students. We've just looked at it for a longer time. So our views are also not correct. They just, because we've had a chance to look for a little bit longer, they might be a little bit less wrong. We might have been able to uncover a little bit some errors and tried to avoid them for however long we've been able to do it. But I'm sure you've noticed, if you've learned, if you are an expert in your field, you know better than anyone else that as soon as you learn something, you are astounded by how much you don't know or how much further there is to learn. And this is, again, I think, something that we could model for our students and help students get better at doing. Which is why I think we should allow them to be able to say anything, literally anything, in the classroom. I don't see if there's any specific questions for me to answer to. I know we got some I wonder if how free students are expressing opinion, wrong or inflammatory, especially for critical theory courses where truth is individual. That's actually an interesting question, Rebecca. One of the things I see in that question is the relativism assumption. If you say that truth is individual, you're already making a claim about what truth is. And so, whoops, I lost it. It jumped somewhere. Still lost it. I don't know where it went. So I think that if views are inflammatory, one of the things that is important to do that I've learned from practice and facilitation is being able to draw a distinction between a level of conversation. If you're talking about the content of the conversation, and let's say it's a class about Hitler's Germany, for instance, or about the El Paso shooter, and you're talking about those things, and then someone gets psychologically frustrated or feels personally attacked or something like that by something that is said, well, then you need to stop the content level of the conversation and then have a meta-level conversation about the psychological issues that have come up so that you can keep those two levels separate so that you can understand if someone's hurt by a statement, then they're taking it as a personal attack. They're getting affected by it in a personal way, which needs to be taken seriously and needs to be addressed, okay, on the level of the interpersonal interaction, on that meta level, so that you can address those things, address the emotions, and address all those other things that happen on the personal level so that they can get addressed, so you can go back to the content level, right? So that you can go back to talking about the subject matter without the interpersonal things getting sort of in the way. And yes, Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed is definitely relevant in this situation. And I would say this. So I'll address the meta level in 1 second. This other question is, how do you handle a student expressing an opinion that another student considers offensive or a microaggression? Again, it's very important. This is why I would encourage students professors that are using Zoom or another platform for teaching to make sure that you could get some kind of video interaction. Even if in Zoom they're going to use a virtual background, so that you can notice facial expressions, so that you can notice responses that other students are having to what you're saying and to what other students are saying. Okay? And if they do, first of all, and if they do judge something as offensive, then immediately the content level of the discussion needs to be put on hold for a minute and say, wait a minute, if you're taking offense to what's happening, then the conversation has shifted to the emotions, to the interpersonal dynamic, to other meta level issues other than the content of what is happening. And microaggressions are fascinating because you could actually have a conversation about them. And one of the things you might find out is that it could have been intentional, but it might not have been intentional. There are many things that people will say without understanding, without being sensitive to the background of the other person, and then the other person judges it as offensive. Okay? But it wasn't intended to be offensive, and it's perfectly understandable that it could be judged as offensive. But part of the background, part of the reason that someone might find it offensive or take it as offense is if they didn't understand that that person had no background understanding of the situation. So give me 1 second. So like, for example, I like to say that I prefer interacting with really young children and really old people. Adults suck to like interact with because for the most part they always have some agenda. They always have something going on. But kids, like if you look fat, they'll just tell you you look fat. Okay? Because they don't know about those social conventions, and so they will just tell it like it is. They're not intending to be offensive. All they're doing is reporting their experience. And I believe that it's possible to be able to take views, take anything that happens in that regard, on that level, if you, because again, if you get personally affected, then you'll get defensive, and then the whole conversation will end up then shifting to another level. But you could find, so if you remember one of my other slides, I'm going to wonder if I can do this again. Try again. Hopefully the technology is working here. But in this one, I think we're here. Where am I? I don't know how many of you are familiar with the fundamental attribution error, but it's an observation in psychology about how we are prone to attribute other people's bad behavior to their character, but our own bad behavior to the situation. So like if you're driving and you cut someone off in traffic, you would say, oh, I had a bad day. I was thinking about this talk I had to do, and then the internet cut out right in the middle of it. But if another person cuts you off, you're likely to, right, say that that person is just a bad person, right? Just an asshole. I know how it works, right? And so, but what do you think would happen if you understood that that person had a bad day? They were distracted because their dog passed away, or something like that because of all of the horrible things that are happening now with COVID-19. And then you thought that for them, it was their view or their behavior was a result of the situation that they were in. Then if you are able to do that, then I think it's possible that something that a microaggression or something that someone finds offensive, you're able to look at the background, look at the biases, look at the presuppositions that are involved if you can uncover them. And that will allow for some level of understanding. And I'm not talking about like we're all going, I get along, I have these optimistic views, right? But, excuse me, but like I'm honestly torn when, why is it doing this? When, for instance, I talked about this thing about uh, diversity in isolation. Right? Can you imagine someone that says, yes, I care about other people and I care that everyone lives the way that they want to live. But I want you to go do it over there because you're living the way that you want to live. Where I'm living is interfering with my being able to survive and flourish. Now that's different than just saying, well, I'm going to kill you. But this is like there's going to be times when we have differences. But if we could uncover, if we could get to a level of like that difference where we both respect diversity, and then because I think it's sort of hypocritical, if I say I want diversity in isolation, but I'm going to kill you, then I'm not really a proponent of diversity. And if then we could come to some understanding about, yeah, diversity and isolation, and I'm very much torn by this. Like, I'll have to do another talk about, like, unity versus diversity and isolation, and what it means in terms of our, like, evolutionary past, in terms of our us versus them mentality, or, like, should we all be living together? These are some of the, like, the dangers of um, what globalization and how the internet has made the world, has made everyone come so much closer, and at the same time, so much more polarized, so much more further apart. Because you know what ends up happening? Now, the flat earthers, before, you may be found like, probably never even heard of like flat earthers, but now, if you have a view, you can go find anyone just by standing right in your house. Go find everyone that believes the same view that you do. And then you go end up watching those views. Why would you go listen to anything else? I fall prey to this too, or I try not to. I showed you that I actually go on Breitbart.com. I want to see what non-fake news, main lamestream media is saying about COVID, about the government shutdown, about how the government is turning into Nazis. We need to understand those views. We want all of these other views being heard. But what we don't want is that isolation. Because if the views are just being isolated, then you're not hearing about these other views. That makes me think of a recent op-ed by the Federal Elections Committee chair, who argues that the problem is not political ads on Facebook and Twitter, but what the problem is micro-targeting. If you know anything about Cambridge Analytica and Facebook in the 2016 elections, you'll know that Facebook is allowed to send political ads just to some people, not to everyone. And I didn't see them. I only found out about them later. There were posts that were calling Hillary Clinton Satan. and was like in league with the devil. Those Facebook posts got targeted to certain people whose psychological profile that Cambridge Analytica had was able to determine that they would be more effective on those people. But that's not in the public forum. The public forum means everyone can hear them, everyone can view them. It's a little bit ironic because Trump says that Twitter was stifling free speech, but isn't Trump stifling free speech by telling Twitter that they can't comment on the claim that they think that Trump's claims are inaccurate? It's a dangerous game that people play in terms of understanding like where they're going to go. Global citizens. Yeah, this is I think that Virgil. I think that issue has something to do with the us versus them problem. You go way back to our evolutionary heritage, and we found out that when we were tribes, when religions were coming about, it would created social cohesion within our group, and then there was in groups and out groups. And we have that in our evolutionary past. And so now a very important question is, what groups do we belong to? Because we do. I have my group as my family. I have my ethnic heritage. Then I think about the planet. I think about the climate struggle. And I think about what group do we belong to? When you're in the classroom with your students, I suggest that you and your students in that classroom are all part of the same one group in that group. So even if there's microaggressions or other things like that, those microaggressions or those other things are actually miscommunications. If you're all trying to do the same thing, then that's what we should continue to try and do. And anytime that's not working, it has to do with some miscommunication, and then are you willing to spend the time and effort to try and understand what that miscommunication is and try and do something about it? And that's why Sean Rosenberg was saying that democracies are dying, because people just don't have the intellectual patience for it. And that's why I take it to be my responsibility, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity to sharing with you how important it is to be intellectually responsible about making sure that everyone inquires, that all views are respected, and that everyone inquires and makes the intellectual effort to try and come to some sort of compromise. And so I wanted to thank you for letting me share my thoughts with you. I apologize about the internet problem, and I appreciate your patience. And I wish you well for whatever you do again. And I will say goodbye in my socially appropriate way.